It's supposed to be the happiest day of your life. Until you find out your bride has been with her ex. Hours before saying I do this is the shocking story of Mark, a groom who faced the ultimate betrayal on his wedding day. Watch how his heartbreaking journey unfolds. Mark had been counting down the days to this moment for months. The wedding of his dreams was only hours away, and the world felt like it was finally aligning perfectly. He stood in the groom's suite, dressed in his sharp tuxedo, adjusting his tie with shaking hands. He couldn't help but feel a knot in his stomach, a mix of excitement and anxiety. He was about to marry Emma, the woman he had loved for years. They had known each other since college, and everything had felt so right between them. Their engagement had been a joyous occasion, filled with love, laughter, and hope for the future. The venue was stunning. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the white flowers that decorated the space. Mark smiled, imagining Emma walking down the aisle toward him in her beautiful wedding dress. He had been imagining this moment for months, his bride, his love, joining him for a lifetime together. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. But as he stood there, waiting for the ceremony to begin, an uneasy feeling gnawed at him. It wasn't just pre-wedding jitters, it felt like something was off, though he couldn't put his finger on it. As the hours ticked down, Mark did his best to push away the nagging thoughts. After all, this was it. The big day. He was marrying the woman he was sure he would grow old with. What could possibly go wrong? But then, just as Mark thought he had shaken off his doubts, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text message from Sarah, one of the bridesmaids and Emma's closest friends. The message was short, almost too brief to make sense of. But the words hit him like a slap across the face. Mark, you need to know something. Emma was with Jake this morning. Before the wedding, she slept with him. Mark's world froze. The room seemed to spin as he read the words over and over, each time trying to make sense of them. Could this be true? His mind raced as his stomach churned. He had trusted Emma with everything, and now this? He stood there in disbelief, staring at the screen. The woman he was about to marry had been with her ex, hours before their wedding. His heart pounded in his chest as the weight of the message settled in. There was no way this was a joke. No way this could be a mistake. He didn't know what to do. His hands trembled, and the room suddenly felt too small. He had to confront her. He had to know the truth, even if it shattered everything he thought he knew about their love. Mark's heart raced as he left the groom's suite, not knowing where his legs were carrying him. His mind was reeling, his thoughts clouded with disbelief. He tried to make sense of the message Sarah had sent. He had always trusted Emma. They had shared so many dreams, hopes, and promises for their future. He never imagined that she would betray him like this, not just hours before they were supposed to exchange vows. Mark could barely breathe as he walked down the hall toward the bridal suite. The uncertainty in his chest was consuming him, but he had to face Emma. He needed answers, even if the truth hurt more than he could possibly imagine. As he approached the bridal suite, Mark stopped for a moment to compose himself. He couldn't believe he was about to confront Emma like this. The woman he had planned to marry just hours before was now the woman who had shattered his trust in the worst possible way. He took a deep breath, wiped the sweat from his palms, and knocked on the door. Emma opened it, her radiant smile quickly fading as she saw the storm in his eyes. "Mark," she asked softly, confusion crossing her face. "What's wrong?" Without thinking, Mark blurted out the words he never thought he'd have to say. "Did you sleep with Jake this morning?" Emma's face turned pale. For a brief moment, she said nothing. Mark could see the guilt in her eyes, and that was all he needed to confirm what Sarah had told him. She didn't deny it. Instead, she hesitated, her voice trembling. I didn't mean for it to happen, Mark. It was a mistake. I was confused, and I didn't know what I was doing." Mark could feel his world crashing down around him. The woman he had planned to marry was standing in front of him, and she had just admitted to sleeping with her ex just hours before they were supposed to be husband and wife. His heart felt like it had been ripped out of his chest. The love they had shared, the trust they had built over the years, seemed like it was all a lie. How could you do this to me? Mark asked, his voice shaking with anger and pain. How could you betray me like this? Emma's tears flowed freely, but Mark could barely bring himself to care. The damage had been done. The love he had once felt was now replaced with a deep, gnawing betrayal. It didn't mean anything, Mark, she pleaded. It was just a mistake. Please, just let me explain. But Mark couldn't hear her anymore. The words didn't matter. The truth was clear. He couldn't go through with the wedding. He couldn't marry someone who had betrayed him so completely, so callously, just before they were supposed to make vows of forever. The air felt thick, suffocating, as Mark made the hardest decision of his life. I'm calling off the wedding, Emma, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't marry you, not after this. Emma's face crumpled as she fell to her knees, pleading with him to reconsider, but Mark had already made up his mind. The trust was gone. The love he had once felt had been shattered, and just like that, everything changed. As Mark stood there in the bridal suite, his heart racing, his mind a whirlwind of emotions, the weight of the situation pressed down on him like a heavy burden. He had never imagined he would be standing in front of Emma like this, her face streaked with tears, begging for forgiveness, while he felt like his world had collapsed into nothing. His chest tightened as the words escaped his mouth, words that felt foreign, but were the only ones he could utter in that moment. How could you do this to me, Emma? Emma's face contorted with pain, and for a fleeting second, Mark saw the vulnerability that once made him fall in love with her. But that moment quickly vanished, replaced by the harsh reality of what she had done. Emma tried to explain, her voice breaking as she said, I didn't mean to hurt you, Mark. It just happened. I was confused. I didn't know how to deal with everything, and Jake, he was there for me. Mark took a step back, his hands trembling at his sides. He wanted to scream, to shout at her for the pain she had caused him, for destroying everything they had built together. He had always believed in Emma, trusted her with his heart, and now, just hours before their wedding, she had shattered that trust in the most painful way possible. She had betrayed him, and now she was pleading for his understanding. His mind raced as he struggled to process the words she was saying. Nothing she could say could undo the hurt he felt. You slept with him, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying all the anger and disbelief that had been building up inside him. How could you do this to me? Just hours before we were supposed to start our lives together. Emma's sobs became uncontrollable, her body shaking as she reached out for him. Mark, please. I love you. I never wanted to hurt you. It was a mistake. I made a huge mistake, and I'm so sorry. But Mark wasn't listening anymore. His heart was drowning in the pain of betrayal, and the words she spoke didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the trust that had been broken. He couldn't marry someone who had been willing to betray him, not once but in the most unimaginable way. The tears in Emma's eyes, her broken words, didn't change the reality Mark had to face. He had been given a glimpse of the truth, and the truth was too painful to ignore. He knew that this was the end. The life they had imagined, the dreams they had shared, everything had crumbled to dust in a matter of minutes. He couldn't look at her the same way anymore. I can't do this, Mark finally said, his voice shaking but firm. I can't marry you. Not after what you've done. Not after everything we've shared. I just can't. Emma's face crumpled further, and she fell to her knees, her sobs echoing in the quiet room. Mark couldn't bring himself to comfort her. He was too hurt, too broken. The woman he thought he would marry had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and there was no going back. He had to let her go. Mark's decision to call off the wedding was the hardest thing he had ever done. His heart was torn between the love he had for Emma and the overwhelming betrayal that had shattered everything. Standing there in the bridal suite, surrounded by the elegant decorations, the soft music, and the promise of a future that would never come, Mark felt like a stranger in his own life. Emma's desperate pleas for forgiveness filled the room, but Mark couldn't hear her anymore. Her words were like a distant echo, drowning beneath the weight of the truth. Nothing she could say would take away the betrayal he felt in his heart. Nothing would erase the image of her with Jake, the man she had once loved, just hours before their wedding. "I can't," Mark whispered again, as though saying it aloud could make it more real. "I can't marry you, Emma, not after this." It felt like the world stopped moving. Emma's face froze, her body trembling as she processed what he was saying. "Please, Mark," she begged, her voice breaking. "Don't do this. We can fix this. We can work through it." Mark shook his head slowly, his chest tight with emotion. "I don't think you understand. This isn't something we can fix. You've broken my trust, Emma. And without trust, there's no foundation for us. I can't just pretend like nothing happened." He could see the shock in Emma's eyes, the realization dawning on her that this wasn't just a fight. This was the end. This was the moment when everything they had worked for, everything they had promised each other, was shattered beyond repair. Mark's heart broke for her, for what they had lost. But he knew deep down that walking away was the only thing he could do. He couldn't stay with someone who had betrayed him in the most intimate, hurtful way possible. He had been standing on the edge of a dream, and now he was falling slowly, painfully, into the harsh reality that everything he thought he knew was a lie. "Please leave," Mark said, his voice cold and firm, even though his heart ached. He needed space. He needed to breathe. "I can't do this anymore." With that, Emma's sobs became louder, but Mark remained unmoved. He couldn't stay in this moment, couldn't stay in the suite with the woman who had just ruined everything. Slowly, he turned around and walked toward the door, leaving Emma behind, her broken pleas echoing in the silence. As he stepped out into the hallway, the weight of his decision pressed down on him. He had just called off his wedding, just walked away from the life he had imagined with Emma. The hardest decision of his life was now behind him, but the pain of betrayal would stay with him forever. The moment Mark stepped into the grand hall, the peaceful ambience that had filled the venue just moments earlier was shattered. The sound of murmurs, followed by hushed whispers, filled the air. As Mark walked past the guests, still reeling from the emotional turmoil of his confrontation with Emma, the tension in the room grew palpable. The wedding, which was supposed to mark the beginning of a lifetime of love and joy, was now hanging by a thread. Mark's mind was still in a haze. The world around him seemed distant, muffled, as though he were living in a dream. He barely registered the stares, the confused faces, the hushed conversations that erupted as the guests began to learn that the wedding was no longer going to take place. They had gathered for a joyous occasion, expecting to witness the union of two souls in love. Instead, they were met with a scene that no one could have predicted. He could hear his name being called from all directions, but his mind was elsewhere. The shock of what had just happened, of what he had just done, was overwhelming. He had called off his wedding, but the consequences of that decision were far-reaching, and Mark had no idea how to navigate the storm that was about to hit. The first person to approach him was his best man, Jake, who had been Mark's closest friend for years. Jake's face was full of concern as he looked at Mark, trying to make sense of the chaos unfolding. "Mark, what's going on?" he asked, his voice low. "Where's Emma? What happened?" Mark didn't know how to explain. He couldn't bring himself to say the words aloud again. She betrayed me," Mark muttered, his voice barely audible. "She slept with her ex this morning. Before the wedding. I couldn't marry her after that." Jake's face went pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked like he had been punched in the gut. "No way." I don't know what to say." He stood there for a moment, at a loss for words. "Man, I'm so sorry." Mark didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked away, the weight of the situation sinking in deeper with every step. The guests, many of whom had been close to both him and Emma, were beginning to react. Some were in shock, others in disbelief, and a few were outright angry, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The murmurs turned into louder discussions, and soon, the entire venue seemed to be buzzing with confusion and judgment. The laughter that had filled the space just moments ago was replaced with tense, awkward silence. The atmosphere had shifted from one of celebration to one of sorrow and discomfort. Mark could feel their eyes on him, and it made him sick to his stomach. He didn't care, though. The wedding was over. Emma had made her choice, and now he was left to pick up the pieces of a broken heart. He didn't owe anyone an explanation, but the stares, the gossip, the disappointment in the eyes of friends and family, he couldn't escape it. As he stood there in the middle of the chaos, Mark realized that nothing would ever be the same again. His life had changed forever. He had lost more than just his bride. He had lost the dream of a future with the woman he thought he knew. And the pain was only just beginning. The hours following the wedding cancellation felt like a blur. Mark had retreated to a quiet room, away from the chaos, where he could finally let the weight of everything settle on him. His heart was heavy with grief, anger, and disbelief. The world he had known, the life he had built with Emma, had come crashing down in one single moment of betrayal. He sat in the dimly lit room, staring blankly at the wall, trying to make sense of the shattered pieces of his life. There were so many questions he couldn't answer. Why had Emma done this? Was there something wrong with him? Had he missed the signs? But no matter how hard he tried to process it, there was one undeniable truth that lingered in his mind. He had been betrayed by the one person he thought he could trust the most. The pain was raw, and it felt as though it would never go away. But even in the midst of that pain, Mark knew one thing for certain: he had made the right choice. Walking away from Emma, from the life they had planned together, was the hardest thing he had ever done. But it was necessary. He couldn't stay with someone who had shattered his trust in such a devastating way. He couldn't pretend that everything was okay when his heart had been broken beyond repair. As the days passed, Mark found himself leaning on his friends and family for support. His best friend, Jake, despite the awkwardness of the situation, was there for him, offering a listening ear and a shoulder to cry on. Mark's family, though initially shocked by the turn of events, rallied around him, providing him with the strength to keep moving forward. In their presence, Mark found comfort, though the hurt still lingered. Emma had reached out to him, calling and texting, begging for another chance, but Mark ignored her attempts to reconnect. He couldn't bring himself to speak to her. The betrayal was too fresh, too raw. The trust that had been broken could never be repaired, no matter how many times she apologized or pleaded for his forgiveness. As time went on, Mark slowly began to heal. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the pain felt like it would never go away, but he knew that walking away from the marriage was the right decision. He had learned the hard way that love without trust could not survive. And though he had lost the woman he once loved, he realized that he had gained something much more important: his dignity and the ability to move on from a broken relationship. In the end, Mark knew that he would be okay. It would take time, and the scars of betrayal would remain, but he was strong enough to move forward. He would find love again, but this time, he would never forget the importance of trust. It was the foundation on which all relationships must be built, and Mark had learned that lesson the hard way. Days passed since the wedding day, and yet Mark still couldn't shake the sense of devastation that had clung to him like a heavy fog. The moments following the confrontation in the bridal suite were still fresh in his mind, each detail replaying over and over. But as time went on, the anger and disbelief began to give way to a dull ache in his chest, a lingering emptiness where his love for Emma had once lived. She had tried to reach out to him. Her calls and messages flooded his phone, each one more desperate than the last, but Mark couldn't bring himself to respond. At first, it was just a few texts, the kind of apology that might have been easy to ignore. "I'm so sorry, Mark. Please, let's talk. We can work this out. I love you." But as the days passed, the messages became more frequent and more pleading. "Please, don't shut me out. I made a mistake. I need you. I'm lost without you." Mark felt a pang of guilt each time he saw her name pop up on his screen. Part of him wanted to pick up the phone, hear her voice, and pretend that everything was okay. But deep down, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. He had seen her for who she truly was, and no amount of apologies could change the fact that she had broken his trust in the most profound way. Her calls continued, more persistent each day. She tried to reach him through mutual friends, begging them to intervene, to help her fix the mess she had made. Emma even showed up at his door one night, her eyes red from crying, her face pleading with him to listen. Mark stood there, frozen for a moment, torn between the love he once had for her and the raw hurt she had caused. But he didn't let her in. He didn't let her speak. He knew that if he did, he would only end up reliving the pain he had already endured. The guilt gnawed at him, but he had made his choice. And deep inside, Mark knew he was doing the right thing. He had walked away for his own sanity, for his own healing. If he allowed Emma back into his life, even for a moment, it would be like reopening a wound that had only just started to heal. He couldn't do that to himself. So he stayed strong, no matter how hard it was. He ignored her calls, her messages, her pleas for forgiveness. He knew that by doing so, he was letting go of the last remnants of their relationship, and though it hurt, he also knew it was necessary. Trust had been broken beyond repair, and no apology could mend the shattered pieces. Mark found solace in the support of his family and friends. They reminded him of his worth, of the love and respect he deserved. Slowly, the pain of Emma's betrayal began to fade, replaced by the quiet strength that came from choosing himself over the broken promises of the past. As weeks turned into months, Mark's decision to call off the wedding became clearer to him. At first, it had felt like a desperate, gut-wrenching choice, something that had been made in the heat of the moment, driven by emotion and pain. But as time passed, Mark realized that walking away from Emma was not just the hardest thing he had ever done, it was the right thing. The pain of the betrayal had been all-consuming in the beginning. It had felt like a jagged knife wound, one that would never heal. The idea of spending the rest of his life with someone who had betrayed him so deeply seemed impossible. There was no going back after what Emma had done. No matter how much she begged, no matter how much she apologized, the trust was gone, and with it, the foundation of their relationship. Mark spent countless nights lying awake, reflecting on the good moments they had shared. He remembered the laughter, the trips, the love they once had for each other. But those memories, while cherished, could no longer outweigh the painful reality of what had happened. Emma had chosen to be with someone else, and she had done so just hours before their wedding, a moment that was supposed to symbolize the beginning of their forever. The hardest part was the sense of loss. It wasn't just losing Emma. It was losing the life he had imagined with her. It was losing the dreams they had built together, the home, the family, the future. But Mark knew that he couldn't continue living in a world where the woman he loved had shown him so little respect. He couldn't build a future with someone who had torn apart the trust they once shared. As the days passed, Mark began to embrace the painful but necessary process of healing. He focused on himself, rediscovering his passions and goals that had been sidelined during his relationship with Emma. His friends and family were there to support him, offering love and encouragement as he navigated this difficult chapter in his life. Looking back, Mark realized that while he had loved Emma deeply, he had also loved himself enough to walk away. The decision to call off the wedding, to let go of the person he thought he would spend his life with, had been incredibly difficult. But in the end, it had been the only choice that allowed him to move forward, to rebuild his life with a sense of trust and self-respect. In time, Mark would learn to trust again. He would open his heart to the possibility of love, but this time it would be different. He would no longer allow himself to settle for anything less than a relationship built on mutual respect, honesty, and trust. The pain of the past would always be a part of him, but it would no longer define his future. The weeks that followed Emma's betrayal were both a blur and a painful clarity for Mark. He found himself grappling with emotions that fluctuated between anger, sadness, and confusion. There were days when he felt hollow, consumed by the loss of the future he had imagined with Emma, the woman he thought he would spend the rest of his life with. But as time moved forward, something else began to emerge: wisdom, shaped by the harsh lessons he had learned in the aftermath of the betrayal. Mark spent long hours reflecting on what love truly meant. He had always thought that love was enough to overcome any obstacle, that love could repair any brokenness. But Emma's infidelity had shattered that belief. Love, he realized, wasn't just about shared feelings, intimacy, or affection. It was about trust. Without trust, love was fragile, a mere illusion built on a foundation that could crumble at any moment. Emma's betrayal had cracked that foundation, and there was no fixing it. He started to realize that the hardest part of the betrayal wasn't the fact that Emma had been unfaithful, but that she had chosen to break something they had both built together. It wasn't just a one-time mistake, it was a conscious decision. She had looked at their relationship, their wedding day, and still chose to sleep with her ex. Mark couldn't reconcile that choice with the woman he thought he knew. The trust was gone, and in its place was a painful reminder that love, no matter how deep, couldn't survive without trust. Mark also began to understand that his self-worth wasn't tied to the approval of others or to the validation of a relationship. The loss of Emma had forced him to confront a difficult truth he had been willing to ignore warning signs, to overlook red flags, all in the name of love. He had put Emma on a pedestal and expected her to be perfect. In the process, he had forgotten that love required mutual respect, honesty, and integrity. As the days passed, Mark found himself becoming more introspective. He realized that the pain he was feeling now wasn't just the result of Emma's betrayal, it was the result of not fully understanding what he needed in a relationship. Moving forward, he knew that trust would be the cornerstone of any future relationship. He would never settle for less than someone who respected him, who valued honesty as much as he did. It wasn't easy. The pain still lingered, but Mark began to rebuild his life piece by piece, trusting that one day he would find a love built on trust and mutual respect. It was hard to imagine that future while the wounds of betrayal were still fresh, but Mark knew that healing was possible, and in time he would find peace. Mark's journey of healing didn't happen overnight. There were days when the grief weighed him down, when the pain of betrayal felt like an unshakable burden. But there were also moments of clarity. When Mark realized that the end of his relationship with Emma wasn't the end of his story, it was the beginning of a new chapter. In the aftermath of the wedding cancellation, Mark sought solace in activities that had always brought him joy but had been pushed aside during his relationship with Emma. He returned to his love for photography, capturing moments of beauty in the world around him. He began traveling again, rediscovering the sense of freedom he had once taken for granted. Each photo, each new place he visited, felt like a small victory, a reminder that life went on, even after the deepest of heartaches. But more than anything, Mark found healing in his relationships with friends and family. They had supported him when the pain was unbearable, reminding him that he wasn't alone. Jake, his best man, stood by him through the darkest moments, offering not just support but also the kind of honest, raw conversation that Mark had needed. They talked about everything from Mark's heartache to the lessons he was learning about love and trust. It was these conversations, filled with vulnerability and truth, that helped Mark make sense of everything he had been through. Mark also began therapy, something he had never considered before, but which became an essential part of his healing process. Through therapy, Mark learned to unpack the emotional wounds caused by Emma's betrayal and the ways in which it had affected his self-esteem. He came to understand that healing wasn't about erasing the past, it was about learning from it and growing stronger. Months passed, and Mark found himself becoming more at peace with his decision to walk away from Emma. He had been through the depths of pain, but now, with each passing day, he was learning to live without the weight of betrayal hanging over him. He had discovered a strength within himself that he hadn't known existed, and with that strength came a new sense of purpose. Mark knew that he wasn't ready for a new relationship yet, but he had no doubt that, in time, he would be. When that day came, he would be ready to give love a second chance, but this time, it would be with someone who shared his values, someone who understood that trust was not just important but essential. Thanks for watching. If you followed Mark's emotional journey from heartbreak to healing, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Your support means so much, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the story. Have you ever experienced something similar? Leave your comments below and join the conversation. Stay strong, trust yourself, and never forget that you deserve the love you give.